Hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Halloween Monday, October 31st. And tonight, we're talking about the home stretch of the midterms.
The most important issue in Arizona when I'm voting is protecting the essence of our democracy.
Former President Obama is campaigning in Arizona with the Democrats running for Senate and governor. We are live in Scottsdale. Republicans are pushing to take control of Congress, and that includes flipping House seats that Democrats usually win. We'll show you how. We're learning more about the attack on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband. What was the suspect planning, and what charges does he face? Also, affirmative action at universities is the target of two cases the U.S. Supreme Court heard today. Danny Savalos joins us with analysis. And the federal investigation into UFOs continues. The truth is out there, and we're getting a few answers. But we might have bigger things than aliens to worry about. So tonight, many children are going door to door looking for candy, and some adults have been going door to door looking for votes. More than 22 million Americans have already voted. That is more than in previous midterm election cycles. And now, both major parties are making their final cases to voters. Democrats are calling on former President Obama as a surrogate. He made his way through Michigan and Wisconsin over the weekend. Tomorrow, he plans to be in Nevada. And on Wednesday, Mr. Obama heads to Arizona. He will campaign for Democratic Senator Mark Kelly and gubernatorial candidate Katie Hobbs. Polling suggests that the races might be close. A New York Times Siena College poll out today shows Senator Kelly statistically tied with his Republican challenger, Blake Masters. Senator Kelly is ahead in the poll by 6 points, but the margin of error is more than 4 points. So technically, it could go either way. NBC political reporter Vaughn Hilliard starts us off tonight from Scottsdale, Arizona, with more. Vaughn, how is it going in terms of surrogates coming out to support their candidates in Arizona?
You know, this is going to be all about turnout here at this point in these final 8 days here, Joshua, because when you're looking at these numbers here, it is clear that this is still very much an open ballgame, not only for the Senate seat, the governor's seat, but also these down ballot, these important down ballot races. When you're asking about the surrogates, there's a reason that it was just announced last night that former President Obama is coming to town on Wednesday, just 48 hours from now. And this is especially significant here in the state of Arizona. This is a place where folks necessarily don't wave the Democratic, the big D Democratic flag around here often. This is a state that has been a long time conservative Republican state, and that's why you even saw in 2018 and in 2020 when Kyrsten Sinema and Mark Kelly ran for the Senate seats, they really ran as this idea of these Arizona independents. So now you have the former Democratic president, Barack Obama, coming and campaigning on stage with Katie Hobbs and Mark Kelly, the candidates for governor and Senate, respectively, here at the same time. It is all about the realization that they need to bring out Democratic support here. When you look at these polling numbers here, the Democrats need everybody that they can get here in order to overcome the candidates like Kari Lake and Blake Masters for the Senate here.
Vaughn, there's been a lot in Arizona in the last few years in terms of election denialism and various claims and lawsuits about how the election went and so on. And now Arizona's Republican Attorney General Mark Brnovich has come out with some new statements about claims of fraud.
Well, I think it's important that we understand who Mark Brnovich is here. He's the Republican Attorney General. He actually ran for the U.S. Senate here to take on Mark Kelly, but he came in a distant third place, largely because he was criticized by the likes of former President Trump and other prominent Republicans here, like Kari Lake, because he was the one person who really had the opportunity to make the case that he found so-called election fraud in Arizona and that Donald Trump actually won Arizona instead of Joe Biden. But the issue was he was never able to prove it because that reality is an actual reality here. And that is where, over the course of the last 2 years, you saw Mark Brnovich and his investigators in the Arizona Attorney General's office try to find the so-called election fraud. he was never able to do so. He came out with 2 reports in recent months. One that downplayed and debunked the idea that there were so-called dead voters who voted in 2020. Then he issued another report earlier this month downplaying and debunking the idea that there were so-called mules who were stuffing ballot boxes in 2020. And that is why it is so striking 1 week here before the 2022 election that he is going on record there in that 60 Minutes interview saying, look, I never found anything, and it is a clown to suggest that there was election fraud that could have changed the 2020 election.
There are still a number of candidates who have continued to deny the results of the 2020 election, and there have been reports of some armed groups monitoring ballot boxes, and a federal judge is apparently allowing them to do that, at least for now. Tell us more about that and what that does to the climate in Arizona ahead of Election Day.
Yeah, a federal judge ruled that these individuals can continue to monitor these election drop boxes despite federal suit attempting to challenge it, making the case that it's illegal voter intimidation. But that federal judge ruled that at this moment, in his words, that these individuals' core constitutional rights could not be infringed, despite there being, quote, serious questions about their actions here. That is going through an appeals process as we speak here. But it speaks to the amount of skepticism that Donald Trump and this Republican Party have injected into the election process here. And you saw in Republican primaries, the candidates backed by Donald Trump who have continued to perpetuate the election denialism were the candidates that won the Republican primaries. And you have seen a record number of Republicans here in the state of Arizona, despite it being a longtime Republican state. A record number came out in 2020 because of Donald Trump. And those candidates who were allies of Donald Trump, they won their primaries. They are not naive to the fact that they need those very voters who are skeptical and also believers of that Joe Biden actually did not win Arizona. They need those folks to come out and vote for their behalf. And when you look at these polling numbers right now, it is a big reason as to why they are such in a dead heat and have a legitimate shot a week from tomorrow to win this election here in the state of Arizona.
All right. Thank you very much, Vaughn. That's NBC political reporter Vaughn Hilliard starting us off tonight from Scottsdale, Arizona. Meanwhile, Republicans are also working to flip House seats that consistently go to Democrats. Some of those seats are here in New York State. 2 candidates spoke with NBC Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale about that. Hey, Ali.
Yeah, Joshua, you look at where Republicans are spending their money in these waning weeks until Election Day, and it's clear they're confident that they'll get the majority, but also that the road to that majority may go through some very blue areas, including New York State.
Thank you.
Republicans are feeling the momentum.
So you're of the mindset it's red wave.
Absolutely.
But taking the majority and how big their majority could be depends on the GOP flipping seats in some of the bluest parts of the country. New York State alone has more in-play House seats than almost anywhere else.
We're going to win races in a lot of places you haven't seen.
That puts Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney at the center of it all.
I'm a gay guy with an interracial family in a district that voted for Donald Trump.
He's not just in a nail-biter of a re-election battle.
So it's not news to me that this is a competitive part of the world.
He's also the guy in charge of helping Democrats keep the House. A tall order for any president's first midterm, made tougher by rising costs and a focus on the economy and crime. His opponent says,
And that's what this election is about, and that's why we are on the verge of winning.
Now, both parties are pouring money into races like this one in the waning weeks of the election, trying to close the deal with voters. Democrats hoping to hold the line, Republicans trying to break it.
In Maloney's district alone, GOP-aligned groups shelled out more than $6 million in the last 2 weeks.
What Maloney said to me is Republicans are setting money on fire here.
So this isn't a function of lighting money on fire. This is a function of voters in this district are fed up and they want change.
Across the map, Republicans investing in states that have elected Democrats for decades. Rhode Island, Connecticut, Oregon, to name a few.
We can't afford Magazina in Congress.
Blanketing the airwaves with ads.
It's all on the line.
Democrats, meanwhile, focused on contrast, especially on abortion rights.
Do you think it's overblown?
Yes, because nobody is in jeopardy of having their reproductive health care taken away from them here in the state of New York.
That mindset might explain why these blue state seats are in play for Republicans. But Democrats are still competitive in red states that already have abortion restrictions. Polls show that's where their pro-choice messaging is resonating most.
If they're going to have some red wave, how come they're still fighting in the toughest districts for us to hold?
That time of year where both parties talk a big game.
You know, this is the home stretch.
But when the money and where they're spending it speaks the loudest.
This time of year, I will say it's helpful to follow the money. Certainly, that helps us figure out where Republicans and Democrats alike are seeing their opportunities on the map. But the other thing I'm paying close attention to, where the surrogates are. Look no further than the fact that First Lady Jill Biden, she spent part of her weekend in New York with, yes, Sean Patrick Maloney in my home district. Joshua.
All right, thank you, Allie. That's NBC Capitol Hill correspondent Allie Vitale reporting. And be sure to tune in tomorrow night at this time for live special coverage of the midterms with Chuck Todd, Kristen Welker, Steve Kornacki, and correspondents across America. They'll break down what you need to know about the most crucial races. That's tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern here on NBC News Now. We are learning more tonight about the attack that injured Paul Pelosi, the husband of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Prosecutors say the suspect, David DePape, was actually after the speaker. He allegedly broke into the Pelosi home in San Francisco early Friday morning. Mr. DePape faces state and federal charges of assault and attempted kidnapping. In a federal charging document, the FBI says he wanted to hold Nancy hostage. That's a quote from the document. And some of its other details are pretty shocking. Among other things, DePape was allegedly prepared to break Speaker Pelosi's kneecaps. The idea was to send her back to Congress injured as a warning to other members of Congress. Police who arrested DePape say he brought zip ties with him, along with tape, rope, and at least one hammer. San Francisco is no stranger to political violence. Back in the 70s, Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk were murdered at City Hall by a colleague, Supervisor Dan White. This evening, the city's district attorney warned against letting politics go too far.
As leaders and as citizens, it is incumbent upon us all to watch the words that we say and to turn down the volume of our political rhetoric. We should be able to all engage in passionate political discourse, but still remain respectful of one another.
A source tells us that Paul Pelosi is awake and appears to remember everything. Law enforcement says he's already spoken with them. Mr. Pelosi is recovering from a skull fracture, arm, and hand injuries. But misinformation about this attack has spread quickly through another San Francisco institution, Twitter. Its new owner, Elon Musk, shared a link to a post that he has since taken down. The post claimed, with no proof, that this was not a politically motivated attack, but a lover's spat gone bad. NBC senior reporter Ben Collins joins us now with more on that here in studio. Ben, a lover's spat? What the hell is this?
Yeah, look, they were trying to find on the far right space of the internet a reason to make this not a political event. They were trying to make it so all of those times they had advocated for Nancy Pelosi getting hurt, maybe on January 6th inside the Capitol, or constantly in these forums where they think she's like the head of the QAnon cabal. They wanted to make it so they had no connection to that sort of violence. So they came up with the opposite. They tried to find like little holes in the police's story. They said, you know, Paul Pelosi was wearing his underwear. Of course it was. It's 2:30 in the morning, right? So they took that to mean like, oh, they must be lovers. Paul Pelosi did a smart thing when he made the phone call in 911, and he said, my friend David, as a way to, you know, try to diffuse the situation.
Throw off the attacker.
Yeah, he actually didn't even say he was getting attacked in the phone call. And the 911 dispatcher knew exactly what was going on. This happens because he was trying to diffuse the situation. But they took that as a way to mean like, oh, they must have been secret friends or lovers. But the truth is, this man, as we now know, explicitly told police that he was after Nancy Pelosi because he thought she was at the top of the pecking order for this cabal that he believes she's running.
What do we know about David DePape's online footprint and the sites that he's frequented, some of the views he's espoused? What do we know about him?
Sure. So police say it was a mixed ideology, but that's really not what was going on here. In 2007, he had a blog that posted pretty standard, bog standard anti-war liberal stuff. 15 years go by, no posts. And then in August of this year, just a cavalcade of QAnon, Pizzagate, these conspiracy theories that there's a cabal of pedophiles at the top of the government. The stuff that you would see constantly on the bad parts of Facebook and YouTube. That's what this guy was into. That's what you saw In August, that's what he was posting over and over again. He's also a Groyper, which is a white nationalist group. He used their language as well. So this was a fully far-right, radicalized person online.
What about Elon Musk's connection to all of this? I mean, he just took over Twitter. We've learned today that the board is now gone. He is truly solely in control of Twitter, and responded to something Hillary Clinton tweeted about political violence with this link from some site called the Santa Monica Observer, I think it's called, which is known to peddling disinformation. What's the fallout, if any, with Elon Musk's tweet?
So the Santa Monica Observer, by the way, I just want to make this clear, once posted that Hillary Clinton died on the campaign trail of 2016 and a body double did the debate for her shortly thereafter. It's that level of, Bat Boy Weekly World News kind of.
News you can use.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what Elon Musk was posting as, the idea that this was not on the level somehow. That's his information diet. You got to remember, last week, right when he bought the platform, he sent a note to advertisers saying this is not going to be a hellhole free-for-all. And 2 days later, he posts that. The guy who runs the site, the guy who probably cannot be banned from his own site. So that's where we're at now. This site is going a vastly different trajectory than it has been for the last few years. It has no fiduciary duty to shareholders. It is Elon Musk's toy for right now.
One of the things that David DePape said to investigators was that he felt like the colonists fighting the British and that he had no choice but to stand up against tyranny. For those playing the home game, by the way, the British fired first at Lexington and Concord, and then we responded. So if that's your political ideology, you need to go back to Schoolhouse Rock. But there's been more concern from a joint intelligence bulletin about this kind of content, this conspiracy-driven violence increasing ahead of the midterms and possibly beyond. How, if at all, is law enforcement preparing for this?
Yeah, it's really difficult because it is true. For every 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 people, only one of them does something about it. And only one of them breaks into a house and tries to break somebody's kneecaps. That is true. That's the truth.
But it only takes one.
But it only takes one. It's one guy with a plan to be able to do this. On January 6th, we had a lot of guys with a plan who organized around that, and that was the pipes of the internet led them all to the same place in the same day, right? That's the worry now, is that might start happening again on more subtle spaces, maybe in Telegram, maybe in other places like that. We also, by the way, saw this in 2018. There was the MAGA bomber, the guy that was sending pipe bombs to people all throughout the country, and also the synagogue shooter in Pittsburgh. There were, like, before midterms, we are a very hyped up nation. We are a very violent nation. And that's what they're worried about right now.
Is there any sense of what can be done to respond to this, react to this, cool things down? I mean, I would like to believe this is not. I see you rolling your eyes, Ben Collins. I know it's your job to stay in this corner of the web, but there's got to be something that can be done, or even that's theorized that can be done, to prevent this from just being an inexorable narration of the end of the world. There's got to be something we can do for the David DePapes of the world.
Yes. The best thing that we can do is get the Ron DeSantis and the Donald Trumps and the Marjorie Taylor Greens, and I know this sounds impossible, but we'll see, to just get out there and say, look, we don't need violence. We have a plan. We can go win the vote in this way. We can, we can't be the violent ones. They need to be the people telling their group that, the trusted narrators need to go in there and say, do not do any violence here. We'll figure this out by voting or through whatever, or through yelling at people or something. But right now, that is not taking place. Like, if Marjorie Taylor Greene was pushing this conspiracy theory today, pretty much well after it's been debunked, Donald Trump hasn't really said anything about this. They need reliable narrators in their own spaces to start pushing back.
NBC's Ben Collins, appreciate you bringing us up to speed on this. Thank you very much. Thank you. Still to come, the future of affirmative action. Will colleges still factor race into their admissions processes? The Supreme Court debated that today. We're glad you're with us on this Halloween for Now Tonight from NBC News. Should universities factor race into the admissions process? The U.S. Supreme Court debated that question today. Justices heard oral arguments on two cases targeting affirmative action. Both cases are brought by the group Students for Fair Admissions. The group is suing Harvard and the University of North Carolina on behalf of white and Asian students. It argues that considering race in admissions violates the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act. The universities argue that race is one of many factors they look at. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson echoed that point.
There are 40 factors about all sorts of things that the admissions office is looking at, and you haven't demonstrated or shown one situation in which all they look at is race and take from that stereotypes and other things. They're looking at the full person with all of these characteristics.
The Supreme Court has ruled for decades that schools can consider race in an effort to foster diversity. Justice Clarence Thomas asked about the benefits of educational diversity.
I didn't go to racially diverse schools, but there were educational benefits. And I'd like you to tell me expressly, when a parent sends a kid to college, that they don't necessarily send them there to have fun or feel good or anything like that. They send them there to learn physics or chemistry or whatever they're studying. So tell me what the educational benefits are.
The oral arguments drew students from both sides of the issue to the Supreme Court steps.
If Harvard and UNC violated what is the current law, which I think from the facts that are presented, they probably both did and seem to be engaging in a lot of racial discrimination, stereotypes about Asian Americans and people of color. And there's the kind of question of should affirmative action exist at all?
What really happens is if affirmative action is damaged in any way, that's really going to hurt minority and minoritized groups across the country. So I'm hoping it stays in place because that would really create an equal playing field, but we'll see.
NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos joins us now to break it down. And Danny, could you just start by painting a picture of what's at stake here? It sounds like what the plaintiffs are after is affirmative action in colleges and universities that take federal funding, both public schools and private schools that receive federal funding. What's at stake there for the plaintiffs and for the defendants?
Yes and no. These are consolidated cases. One is against UNC, a state school, and the other is against Harvard, which is a private school. So Title VI is at play for any school, which is both of them, which is really every school that takes federal funding. But in addition, the claim against the University of North Carolina, because it's a state school, is also grounded in the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, which because UNC is a state school, it's a state actor in a way that Harvard is not. So very interesting is that the Supreme Court consolidated these two cases, which in the lower courts, the appellate courts, were decided on essentially the same ground. So arguably, you might intuit that the only reason to take both of these cases and bundle them together is that you're going to issue one opinion as to one case or one opinion as to another case and have a split result.
Explain what it is that the plaintiffs want. If they prevail at the Supreme Court, would that mean that colleges and universities are forbidden from asking about race in any way at all? They can't bring it up. They couldn't have you write an essay about it. If you mention it in a student essay, they have to ignore it. What would victory look like for the plaintiffs?
That's a really interesting question there because, I hadn't really considered do they have to X out areas of an essay that mention race? I don't think they would have to do that. I've long thought that when it comes to college admission essays, it's whatever's interesting, no matter what it's about. But it would, if the students group here is successful, it would end the use of race as a factor in admissions, whatever that is. And that's part of the challenge is what is the test? What is using race in admissions? This is what the court has struggled with when they started back in 1978 with Bakke. And that case, they said, well, you can't have quotas. That's too obvious. But you can use this holistic method by guess what university? Harvard, which at the time was the gold standard. And it's no surprise that Harvard is being attacked again. The irony is not lost on the court. So over years, that became, well, at Michigan, we had a point system. Well, that's no good. That's too obvious, too. Instead, you have to go back to this holistic method, whatever that is. So I would argue that, look, these universities have been painted in a corner since 1978 by the Bakke decision, which really, and it's the subsequent decisions, haven't really given them really concrete guidelines. They've had to try out admissions policies and then just hope they don't get sued.
So you mentioned Bakke versus California. We had a graphic just a second ago about another case called Greta versus Bollinger, which also dealt with the 14th Amendment and the matter of affirmative action. Let me get to another clip from the oral arguments today. Here is part of the questioning from Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Listen.
But we know we have 9 states who have tried it, and in each of them, as I mentioned earlier, white admissions have either remained the same or increased, and clearly in some institutions the numbers for underrepresented groups has fallen dramatically, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
All right.
And that was a question to an attorney for the University of North Carolina. It sounds like what Justice Sotomayor is trying to get at is that finding other ways to go about this in a more race-blind way have already been tried and been rebuked by at least some of the institutions who have tried it. Is that right?
Yeah, there are a couple of problems with that, too. If you use what is facially a race-neutral policy, but the hidden meaning behind it is racial anyway, then it's subject to the same challenge ultimately under a separate Supreme Court test, but you can still challenge that. So I don't think that really solves the situation. And frankly, I think Justice Thomas honed in on the ultimate challenge here. And this may not be a popular take on it, but after all these years, what is diversity? I think diversity means something different to you than it would to me, than it would to 20 people that we asked on the street what diversity is. So that if we have this kind of nebulous definition of what diversity is, and the only reason that schools are allowed to discriminate is to achieve diversity, if we don't know exactly what diversity is, then how can it be this compelling interest? And I think that's the way the court's ultimately going to go. I think the conservative majority is going to conclude that diversity is no longer a compelling interest. Those are magic words. If it's no longer a compelling interest, then it's not the kind of thing that can justify using race as an admission standard in any way. And I think that's probably the direction the court is ultimately going to go here.
Before I have to let you go, Danny, I forgot to ask one of the more obvious questions. Why is this group representing white and Asian students? What is the harm that they argue that race-conscious admissions has caused them?
They're alleging that they are essentially the losers if the theory is anytime you use race in admissions, there are winners, people who get in because of their race, and people who don't get in because they were not chosen because of their race. And that's the essence of the argument against affirmative action, that affirmative action is discrimination itself. It's an ironic kind of discrimination in that it seeks to end discrimination by discriminating. And so that is the challenger's argument here, that the plaintiffs here are the group of people that is losing as a result of affirmative action, that they are the ones when you make a race-conscious decision to admit someone, even if it's a tiny factor, if it results in somebody getting in because of their race, then that means somebody else didn't get in because of their race. And that, of course, I mean, there are statistics on each side of the argument that we could dive into, and they just say all kinds of interesting things. But that's really, when you boil this argument down, that's what the petitioners, that's what the Asian and white challengers are really arguing.
And I presume, last 10 seconds, I presume they were able to grapple with the possibility that maybe they weren't admitted because of their race, maybe they just weren't admitted because they were not good enough to get in. Did they grapple with that at all today?
There's always that. That was certainly brief because that's in the statistics. But again, I mean, that's the challenge with this holistic method, because do we ever really know if it was you got in because you were the tuba player or you got in because of your race? And that is where Bakke has left us, because you have to be so subtle now in considering race that it's hard to really say what race factored in admissions. In this case, the argument for the people who want affirmative action to continue is essentially, don't worry, it's not a big deal, but it's a big deal, don't get rid of it. So there's irony on both sides. It's a fascinating argument. Unfortunately, I don't think it's a close call. The six justices have the votes. Affirmative action is probably over.
NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Danny, appreciate you walking this through with us tonight. Thank you very much. Now, the Supreme Court also got a request today from former President Trump. At issue, his tax returns. He's asking the court to intervene in a fight over whether members of the U.S. House can get them. A lower court ruled that the House Ways and Means Committee has a right to see them. Mr. Trump wants the Supreme Court to block that while he appeals that ruling. Meanwhile, the trial against his family business began today in New York State Supreme Court. A jury in Manhattan heard arguments for a criminal tax fraud case against the Trump Organization. Prosecutors accused the business of a 15-year scheme to avoid taxes. Here's NBC investigative correspondent Tom Winter.
Opening statements underway in the Trump Organization trial today, and we also got our first witnesses. Prosecutors here in Manhattan with the district attorney's office say that the Trump Organization is a criminal entity, not going after the former president himself, but instead looking into 15 years, according to them, of an alleged scheme to pay benefits to its CFO, Alan Weisselberg, talking about luxury cars, talking about apartments, garage for those cars, as well as benefits to Weisselberg and his family that were not properly accounted for, and they did not properly pay the taxes to New York State to the tune of approximately $1.7 million for Weisselberg. Prosecutors calling this a case of cheating and greed, that the Trump Organization was also responsible for paying the appropriate taxes and for accounting for those benefits. Trump's defense in their opening statement saying, wait a minute, this is about the benefits for our CFO. It wasn't illegal that he got those benefits. It was illegal that he did not pay the appropriate taxes on those benefits, but he's pleaded guilty, and he's pleaded guilty under an enormous amount of pressure in order to avoid a significant jail sentence. You'll hear from him. It's about his greed, but it's not about us. The benefits to the Trump Organization, they say, were negligible. The first witness of the day, the Trump Organization controller, Jeffrey McConney, prosecutors using him as a witness to get through the complicated financial documents and filings in this case, talking about the Trump General Ledger, talking about 1099 and W-2 forms that were filed in this case. And he's expected to be back on the stand tomorrow when this trial gets underway around 9 a.m. From Lower Manhattan, Tom Winter, NBC News.
We will get to some of today's other top stories in just a moment, including a stampede in South Korea that left more than 150 people dead. Suspects in custody after a pedestrian bridge collapsed in India. And missile strikes in Ukraine that have left many people without running water. Quick update about the attack against House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi. We just got a statement from the speaker, very brief, so I'll read it in its entirety. Quote, since the horrific attack on Paul early Friday, we have been deluged with thousands of messages conveying concern, prayers, and warm wishes. We are most grateful. It goes on to read, quote, thanks to the excellent trauma care medical team at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital, Paul is making steady progress on what will be a long recovery process. Our family thanks everyone for their kindness, unquote. Again, that is a statement issued just this evening. We got it just minutes ago from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi regarding the attack on Paul. Again, the man accused of attacking him, David DePape, faces an array of local and federal charges for what increasingly appears to be a politically motivated attack. We'll keep an eye on that and bring you any more updates this evening as they emerge. Let's continue tonight's headlines in Seoul, South Korea. That nation is in mourning after Halloween celebrations turned deadly this weekend. A crowd surged into a narrow alley, causing a stampede. More than 150 people were killed. 100 more were wounded. NBC Tokyo correspondent Kaori Injoji has more.
South Korea is struggling to piece together how 154 young lives were lost this weekend. Many were in their teens and 20s. Twice as many women as men were killed in this tragedy. Thousands were packed so close together in a narrow alley in Itaewon that they were crushed, toppling over each other down a slope. A shaken nation is asking why more police weren't on the scene. The police chief telling us today and apologizing that officers on the scene couldn't detect that a sudden crowd was appearing, saying that their focus on that night was crime prevention rather than crowd control. Halloween has grown into a very popular event in South Korea over the last few years, and people are saying that the police should have known that there would be a big crowd this year, especially after 2 years of very strict COVID restrictions. 26 foreigners died in the tragedy, including 2 Americans, both in their 20s, both on study abroad programs from their respective universities. 48 hours later now, more than 30 are still in serious condition. The pavement near Itaewon Station, where the tragedy took place, it has become a makeshift altar. People are coming to lay flowers and to leave drinks for those who died, as is the tradition in South Korea. This has been a tragedy for South Korea, and after just 6 months in office, possibly a defining moment for South Korean President Yoon. Back to you.
That's NBC's Kaori and Joji reporting. In India, military teams have been searching for survivors after a pedestrian suspension bridge collapsed. Fair warning, you may find some of this video hard to watch. Hundreds of people were on the bridge yesterday when it gave way into a river. The collapse killed more than 130 people, including children. Rescuers pulled more than 170 survivors from the water. The bridge was built back in the late 1800s. It reopened last week after months of repairs. But the attraction was drawing a rush of sightseers during the Hindu festival season. But right before the collapse, CCTV footage shows a group of men appearing to rock the bridge from side to side. Today, police arrested 9 people, including ticket staff and security guards. The U.S. government has contributed billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine, but NBC News has learned of a tense exchange between President Biden and Ukrainian President Zelensky over that support. Mr. Biden apparently lost his temper in a phone call. Back in June, the president called to share the news of another $1 billion worth of military aid. In response, President Zelensky laid out more requests for help. That is apparently when Mr. Biden told his counterpart that he could be a little more grateful. According to White House officials, their relationship has only improved since that call. Ukraine may well need more help from its allies. Recent missile strikes have knocked out water and power in some areas. NBC foreign correspondent Matt Bradley has more from Ukraine.
Well, after yet another morning of Russian bombardment of critical civilian infrastructure here in Kyiv and really throughout Ukraine, there were about 80% of Kyivans in the capital city who were left without access to water. And we saw images all day long of residents of this city, the capital of Ukraine, lining up at really wells to try to collect water in order to bring home. Well, over the course of the day now, that number of people who didn't have access to water through the tap, that's now decreased to only about 40% in this city. And also electricity has soared up quite a bit, too. It looks like that level has decreased quite a bit. So now a lot of services are back. And probably within the next 24 hours, we're going to see even more civilian utilities restored. But the fact of the matter is that this is the 3rd Monday in a row that the Russians have targeted key civilian infrastructure. And that pattern looks set to continue. But we also heard from the Ukrainians that it was thanks to anti-air systems mostly provided by the West, that the Ukrainians were able to shoot down 88% of incoming fire from the Russians that, again, were targeting mostly civilian infrastructure. And it was only a couple of weeks ago that Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission called that, targeting a civilian infrastructure, a war crime. But also in other news related to civilian well-being, we've started to see the impact of the Russians pulling out of that grain deal. Now we just saw 12 ships pulling out of some of those southern ports, delivering grain to cities throughout the world. Now it's unlikely that that's necessarily going to continue because the Russians have signaled that they're not going to be supporting that deal, that movement of grain out of those southern ports any longer after the Ukrainians successfully sank several ships in the port of Sevastopol in the Crimea. That could have a knock-on effect for people throughout the world who rely on Ukrainian grain, and it really is going to create a trust deficit for any future diplomatic negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians.
That was NBC's Matt Bradley reporting from Ukraine. Brazil's former president is preparing to take office again, but will the current leader concede the race? We'll have more on the election and what it could mean for the world just ahead. Stay close. It looks like Brazil's former president is heading back into office. This weekend, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva narrowly beat the incumbent Jair Bolsonaro. President Bolsonaro has not conceded yet. He's expected to speak tonight or tomorrow. According to the Washington Post, Mr. Bolsonaro told his cabinet he does not plan to contest the election, nor does he plan to congratulate his opponent. NBC News has yet to confirm this. In the past, Jair Bolsonaro has criticized the election system. But for the man they call Lula, it marks a political comeback. He was president of Brazil from 2003 to 2010. He spent a year and a half in prison on charges of corruption and money laundering, but his sentence was eventually overturned. World leaders are recognizing Lula's victory. President Biden tweeted his congratulations yesterday, and he described the elections as free and fair. Today, Argentina's President Alberto Fernandez met with Lula in Brazil. President Fernandez called Lula a partner, and the president-elect is set to take office on January 1st. Joining us now is Bruna Santos, a senior advisor at the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute. Ms. Santos, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you.
Could I just ask you to put the... Of course. Could I begin by just asking you to put this in a little context for maybe people who didn't follow the election, who don't really have a scope of Brazil's politics? Why does the election in Brazil matter to us in the United States and to the rest of the world?
Well, there's no doubt that this election was a crucial election, a very, I think, consequential election for the world and Brazil, both democratic history and environmental history. I think that it was by far the most bitterly fought election in Brazilian history. Also, it's the first time that we have a president elected for a third mandate, which is Lula. It's the first time we have an incumbent defeated. It's the first time that we have such a tight election victory. Lula won by 2 million votes, and that's not much in Brazil. So I think we saw an unprecedented election in our history. And what we saw yesterday is that when we saw Lula won, we saw the democratic institutional fabric in Brazil, the Supreme Court, the Electoral Court, the Speaker of the House. They were all like conceiving and recognizing Lula's win. So I would argue now that despite Bolsonaro's instigation in the raised fears of violence, in his silence, it's unlikely that the military would question the victory of Lula in this runoff. And for now, the prospect of an invasion in Congress in Brasilia, comparable to what happened in the United States in January 6th last year, it seems less conceivable. So I do believe that Bolsonaro will, as you said, not concede or congratulate the winner, but his allies, his close allies, and his sons has already recognized Lula's win.
Talk about some of the priorities for Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva as the new president. Presuming that everything goes smoothly, he's inaugurated on January 1st and so on. Talk about some of the things that are high on his to-do list. One, of course, has to do with Brazil's civic institutions, as you just mentioned. Some of the concerns that Jair Bolsonaro raised. He was very much compared to Donald Trump in an array of ways in Brazil. Then, of course, Brazil's custodianship of the Amazon rainforest is very key. What else are some of the top-line priorities for the next president?
Well, first of all, the country is coming out of grief and political and economic turmoil. So definitely social issues and concerns. The concerns are social issues and the economy. Brazil is still recovering from the effects of the recession in 2014, and we have not recovered from that. Inflation is extremely high, and Lula has committed that his priority is to guarantee economic recovery and social prosperity. At the same time, he doesn't lose control over the country's fiscal situation, which is already very fragile. So in all his statements, he assures the return of a state-driven economic growth model. And of course, as you said, among other promises is like combating the destruction of the Amazon rainforest and probably like positioning Brazil in the international chessboard again. He said yesterday, Brazil is back, and we have now to rebuild the country and the image that the country has internationally.
Bruna Santos of the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute. I appreciate you talking this through with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Before we go, we will have a look at what Halloween looks like this year and the strange tale of real-life UFOs. The U.S. government is identifying those flying objects. So, what are they? Fans of the X-Files might look at this next story a little sideways. But yes, the U.S. government actually is trying to identify a number of flying objects. We usually call them UFOs. The new term is UAPs, unexplained aerial phenomena. Intelligence officials were reportedly going to update Congress on their findings today. But how much will we learn from their latest report? NBC's Gotti Schwartz has the story.
Top intelligence officials are set to deliver an updated UFO report to Congress. The hope that it'll provide explanations for some of the hundreds of UFO sightings in recent years. Officials familiar with the findings telling the New York Times most resolved cases were caused by weather balloons, trash in the sky, or foreign spying. While it's not clear how much of the Pentagon's findings will be made public, officials with the Department of Defense tell NBC News it's committed to the principles of openness and accountability to the American people, which it must balance with its obligations to protect sensitive information, sources, and methods. Intelligence officials have been able to explain some of the unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP sightings in the past, telling lawmakers last year these glowing pyramid shapes flying over a Navy destroyer off the coast of California were likely drones captured through night vision. Military officials now telling the Times this sighting, which appears to show an object flying at incredible speeds, could be an illusion. And whatever is in the video might only be flying at around 30 miles an hour. They also tell the Times this rotating object flying near Navy pilots is a result of the optics of a classified image sensor used to help target weapons.
Splashed.
Still, there are sightings that remain unexplained, like the videos captured by airline pilots earlier this year showing lights flying for hours near the Big Dipper, which some analysts say could be satellites.
Let's say 99% of all of these cases turn out to be something normal. Where does that leave us?
These cases that they just cannot explain, that is not only a national security problem, it should make everyone in the world curious as to whether we've already been visited or not.
Still, defense officials say many sightings remain unidentified because there is often not enough information collected during the encounter, telling us there is no single explanation that addresses the majority of UAP reports, and we will not rush to conclusions in our analysis.
Now, these officials that spoke anonymously to the New York Times say some of this is likely spying by the Chinese, adding that they may be trying to learn how U.S. trains its military pilots. But how much of that or any of the more mysterious stuff gets declassified is still yet to be seen. Back to you.
That's NBC's Gotti Schwartz reporting. And before we go, a quick look at Halloween and our occasional feature, 60 Seconds of Joy. You might notice some teal pumpkins outside homes tonight. Those signal that the home offers candy and non-food trinkets to accommodate children with food allergies. It's part of a safety campaign called the Teal Pumpkin Project. Check out this new image from NASA. It's a picture of the sun. Kind of looks like a big space pumpkin. Those dark patches appear when fast solar winds gush out into space, and that did prompt a minor geomagnetic storm watch on Saturday. And in Mexico City, an annual parade began celebrations of Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. Thousands cheered on Saturday as giant floats made their way through the streets. The Mexican holiday honors deceased loved ones with celebrations instead of sorrow. We always celebrate you making time for us. Please remember, tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern, Chuck Todd and Kristen Welker will host a Meet the Press election special. They'll break down the key races and what is at stake. That is tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern here on NBC News Now. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Have a happy and safe Halloween. I'm dressed as a superhero incognito. This is what I'd look like. Don't want to give away who I am, right? Great. I wear this costume every single night. See you Wednesday. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.